Hey everybody, it's Emily at ARG Schooling, and it is time for my favorite video of the year. It is time to talk about my favorite books of 2024. So I've spent weeks figuring this out, and I think I've come to my list, my top 10. But before I get to my top 10, I want to talk about some books that I would consider honorable mentions. These are things that I loved. They just weren't quite on par with what I ended up putting in my top 10. I will also say that looking at my list, I am quite the eclectic reader. Like, I don't know that people could pinpoint like my reading tastes because I'm all over the place. Let's talk about the honorable mentions first. So the first book I want to shout out is the one I just finished reading, and that is Against the Darkness by Kendare Blake. This is the third book in the In Every Generation trilogy. This is like the next generation of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I really can't tell you anything about this book because it is third in a trilogy, and everything I could possibly tell you that I loved about it is a spoiler. But I enjoyed my time with this book so much. It was a great way to end the year, I think, because I'm pretty sure that's like the last thing I'm going to read this year. And it was just so much fun. It was has so much nostalgia attached to it, even though it's written to be set now, and like all of the characters that we know and love from Buffy are like aged up to like be taking place now. We're following Frankie, who is Willow's daughter and the new Slayer. And it's great. If you've watched Buffy all 7 seasons and you love that and you wish there was a continuation that like carries on the characters through now, this is the thing. This is what you want. Like, I haven't read the comics. I know some of the main plot beats from the comics, but I haven't read them. But like this is like exactly what I would want. I think Kendare Blake has done an amazing job. Moving on, I also wanted to give a little shout out to Such Sharp Teeth by Rachel Harrison because I've talked about it a ton this year. I feel like I've mentioned it numerous times, and if it wasn't somewhere on this list, I think people would be like, what about Such Sharp Teeth? Because I have talked about it a lot, and it was a lot of fun. It wasn't quite top 10 material, but like I feel like going forward I'm going to end up loving Rachel Harrison's books. That book was so much fun that I feel like the more of her stuff that I read, the more I'm going to like it. This was a werewolf story. It was like, I've been calling it Hallmark horror because it feels like a Hallmark movie, except with horror elements added to it, like small town, girl goes home to help out her family, runs into old friends and maybe like new love, but also she gets attacked by a werewolf and is now transitioning and has to like deal with that on top of everything else. So like it was a really good time. And then Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay, shockingly, ended up here instead of in my top 10 where I thought it would be, but looking at my top 10, I was like, actually, I think this is an honorable mention. I loved this book though, like don't get me wrong, it's amazing. It just doesn't quite hit the right notes to be in the top 10, I guess, but like it was excellent. This is a like found footage horror movie that gets like respawned and people are like reflecting back on it, and you're following one of the actors who survived the filming of this movie. Like it's cursed. It's like a cursed film kind of situation where like everyone else who made it is dead and he is the last person still alive, and he goes to different like horror conventions and stuff, and he has a fan following, and they're going to remake the movie. And this was so weird and so good. Like the audiobook especially, I think was excellent. There are scenes in the book that are like literally like table readings of the script, and you have like a full cast reading it and like stumbling over words or like repeating themselves because it's like it's a table reading of the script. So like I thought this was a great time. Love an ambiguous ending. This was excellent. Then I have to talk about middle grade. I read so much middle grade this year. And when I sat down and thought about it, like what was my favorite middle grade of the year? First up, I'm going to have to say When We Flew Away by Alice Hoffman is on this list. Although I do hesitate to call it middle grade because I really feel like this is more YA than middle grade, but it's labeled as middle grade, so that's where I'm going to stick it. And so this is a like prequel to Anne Frank's diary, and I really think you should read Anne Frank's diary first if you want to read this book, because I think if you've never read Anne Frank's diary and you read this first, it's not going to feel the same. Like I think you need to have that like grounding in who Anne was for this book to work. So if you're thinking of reading it, read Anne's diary first, or assign to your children Anne's diary first. I think it works better that way, but I thought this was beautiful, very well researched. I know not everyone will love it. Some people just want Anne Frank to be left alone, and I fully understand that. I too hesitated about this book, but I gave it a chance because it's Alice Hoffman, and I figured if anyone could do it justice, it would be her. And I feel like she did do it justice. Another favorite middle grade for me was Not Nothing by Gail Forman. I loved this book. This is a story about a boy who's done something terrible, and his punishment is community service hours, working or volunteering. His punishment is community service hours volunteering at a nursing home, and that is where he meets Josie, who is a 107-year-old man who has not spoken a word in years. And he decides that this boy needs to hear his story. And it's a story about like an old man who survived the Holocaust and World War II and all of that, and his story of how he was able to survive. And this book broke me in the best way. Like, I cried. I cry a lot when I read, but like this book hit hard. and I felt like I wanted everyone to read it. Like, I want people to pick this book up because I think it's a beautiful story about how we can do something awful but still find a way back to the light. We shouldn't necessarily label someone by their worst action without giving them the opportunity to do good things. And that's kind of what the story is about. And I thought it was excellent. It's a beautiful story. I recommend it. And then the last honorable mention I want to give you is Codename Kingfisher by Liz Kessler. This is another middle grade. It's about World War II and Jewish resistance and just resistance in general. And it's a story that is like told in flashbacks. And so you have two timelines. You have the modern day timeline where this girl is doing a project for school where she has to make a family tree and do a project about her family history. And she feels like that's impossible for her because she doesn't know half of her family. And the side of her family she does know, her grandmother refuses to talk about anything that happened to her prior to her marriage, basically. So like her whole history is a mystery. And so she's frustrated, and her grandmother is starting to show signs of dementia. They're going to be moving her into a home, and like this is the last opportunity she has to find out anything. So she decides to start asking her questions. She finds some old letters in the attic, and like it leads her down this path of discovery. And you're also getting the grandmother's story about the years when she was living in the Netherlands during World War II. And it's like about her and her sister. This book was so good. Like, Liz Kessler's writing is great. She really sucks you into the story and makes you care so much about the characters. And like it's one of those books where you can easily get lost in it. And I think it's definitely worth picking up. I know this is like a way overdone topic and not everyone wants to read that anymore, and I totally get that, but for me, it worked really well. I loved it. Okay, those are the honorable mentions. I know there was a lot. But now I want to talk about my top 10 of the year. And these are in no particular order because I literally could not decide which one was my absolute favorite. So let's just start with The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This was a reread and it was so much better the second time. I read this with book club a few years ago and I didn't get it. I like felt really dumb the whole time. I felt like I was missing something. It just, nothing worked for me and I felt stupid. Like maybe I'm not meant for this, but I'm glad I gave it a second chance. This was a 12 recommendations from 12 friends book, so like I had to push myself through it. And I was like, you know what? We're gonna do it. Actually, I was going to read the sequel since I'd already read this, but then I could not for the life of me remember anything from this book. And then I looked up a synopsis of it to see if that would jog something, and it didn't. So I thought, you know what? I'm just gonna read this again. This was so much better the second time. I think knowing the main beats of the story helped me to stop overthinking about things and just focus on like what was actually happening. And that made me love this book so much. Like I really might consider even continuing because I'm curious as to what will happen next. This is a story set in a world where there are these major like I don't even want to say climate disasters because sometimes it's literally like giant earthquakes and things like that. And like those are called fifth seasons where like the world kind of falls apart and then you have to rebuild it. And those seasons can last for decades or even longer. And so you have these people who have power over the earth and that they can help to control that. And we're following one of those characters who is like throughout her life learning about her power and how to harness it and what it means to have this power and how other people view them. And it was just really, really interesting. I definitely recommend if you've been intimidated by this book or if you read it before and you felt like you didn't get it, try reading it again because I feel like now I get it and it makes sense to me and I really loved it. I ended up giving it 5 stars, so it ended up in my top 10 of the year. Next, I want to talk about a nonfiction that I really loved this year. I found myself thinking about this book a lot after finishing it, which is why it's here, and that is The Dictionary People, The Unsung Heroes Who Created the Oxford English Dictionary by Sarah Ogilvie. What a weird book to put in my top 10, right? Like, I read this for level 11 when I was writing the update. I added this in and I just loved this so much. I found myself thinking about it a lot, like what would it have been like to be able to contribute to something like this? Like I wish that I could have been one of these people, like researching words. It's one of those things where I feel like you almost have to be neurodivergent to find this interesting. But it was fascinating, like the idea of collecting language, collecting words and submitting for a dictionary, like it being like this crowdsourced project. Like I can't imagine how cool that would have been to have like to be a woman or someone who is like on the outskirts of society and doesn't generally get to participate, being able to contribute to something like this. I think that's amazing. And like this was just such an interesting read. Highly recommend it. The next book I want to talk about I don't have a copy of because I borrowed it from the library and I kept saying I was going to buy myself a copy and I just didn't. And that is The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. This was my first time reading Tananarive Due. I've been wanting to read one of her books for ages. And I think I did read one of her short stories in a collection and I liked that. And so that made me feel like maybe this is a book I would like. And this is exactly the kind of horror that I love. I love anything historical. And this was like almost more historical than horror. Again, like horror is such a weird subjective genre that it's so hard to pinpoint. Like I hear a lot of people saying, well, that wasn't actually horror, but like it is. This is definitely one of those books that straddles that line. There are technically ghosts in it. And that I think is what lends it more toward the horror. But like even just even if it wasn't for the ghosts, the things happening in this story are so horrific that I feel like it still would be horror. This is a story about the Jim Crow South and a boy who gets involved with the wrong people, and he ends up getting put into this horrific, like, juvenile detention center kind of a situation for troubled youth, and they horrifically mistreat the boys there. And because it's the Jim Crow South, and because our main character is a little black boy, it's really upsetting. So if that is something that you feel like you're sensitive about, like, don't necessarily pick this up, because it is awful, the things that are happening. But like, has this ability to see haints, and they kind of like protect and guide him while he's there and help him to kind of solve a mystery and get vengeance and stuff. And it's so good and so beautifully written, and I felt like it was really impactful, and I really want to read more of Tananarive work going forward. James made my top 10. Unsurprisingly, like, I just knew this book was gonna be a favorite, and I'm so glad that I bought and read it this year. This is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn, which I've always said is one of my favorite classics. I love Mark Twain's writing, and I've always been partial to Huck Finn. It's one of the few books that I made it through in high school. Like, I used to really struggle with reading things that people told me to read, so I rarely finished anything, but I finished Huck Finn. So I was really intrigued by this, and I thought this was almost like a separate thing. Like, yes, it connects to the story, and it is still Jim, and it's got Huckleberry Finn in it, and it's kind of the same story, but this feels so completely separate that I don't even think, like, if you've never read Huck Finn, I think you could pick this up and still thoroughly enjoy the story for what it is. In this story, James is the one telling what's happening, and so you're seeing all of this through his perspective, and I don't really want to tell you too much more than that, because I feel like this book speaks for itself in so many different ways. Like, it's so rich and like really beautifully told, and I don't know that I can say anything about it that would like do it justice, but I loved this. I thought it was very well done. I thought the writing was spectacular. I really want to read something else by Percival Everett, because this is another author I've never read from before, and he has quite the backlist, so I need to pick something else up. Another horror on my list is Fantasticland by Mike Bakoven. This is another one that I just knew was going to be a favorite. Like, I had such good feelings about this, and I loved it so much. This, again, I would recommend the audio, because I really feel like that adds an extra like layer to the story, because it's told in an interview style, so you're like hearing from all these different people and their perspectives on what happened during this event. So basically, this is about an amusement park in Florida, and it's kind of like Disney World, but not really. And there's been this like big hurricane, and people were supposed to evacuate, and not everyone did. And some of them just hunkered down in the theme park. Mostly the workers were all like, we're just gonna wait it out. We'll stay here. It'll be safer that way. And they're trapped in this theme park for weeks. And this is all about like what actually went down while they were stuck there. Sort of a Lord of the Flies kind of a situation. And it was a really good time. Like, I had such a fun time listening to this. And I've been thinking about it a lot ever since. Like, this is one of the ones that really stuck with me. Yet another horror, Mayfly by C.J. Leede, was one of my favorites of the year. Obviously, this is not for everybody. I feel like this is the closest I'm gonna ever get to reading extreme horror, because I don't generally like a lot of gore and stuff like that, but this is really gory. This is really gross in moments, but I had such a fun time with it. We're following a character named Maeve who works by day as a Disney princess. They never say it's Disney, but like, they're describing Elsa. So she's a Disney princess, and she loves her job. But Maeve isn't quite right. And she lives with her grandmother, who was like an old-time famous Hollywood actress, and she also isn't quite right, but she's very old and sickly, and Maeve lives with her and takes care of her. And we kind of watch Maeve just like go on this descent into chaos over the course of the story, and it was so much fun. I think this is on par with like American Psycho as far as like the vibes and the like descent into chaos and murder and that kind of thing, but loved this. I screamed, I yelled. I haven't gotten that like involved in a story while I was reading it in a while, and I thought this was excellent. On a completely different note, I read The Postcard by Anne Berest with book club this year, and this was one that really stuck with me throughout the whole year. I thought about this book frequently. This is a story about a woman who is sort of investigating her family's history to try to understand what this postcard she received in the mail is all about. She gets a postcard in the mail, and it just has the names of these family members that died during the Holocaust, and she doesn't know what this postcard is about, why it came to her. There's no return address. She's like, why would anyone send me this? And it sends her on this mission to like find out more about these people and why she would have received this postcard. And it's so beautifully written, but also just so, I don't know what word I want to use here. Like, I want to say impactful, but I don't know if that's the right word. But it was very meaningful to me. It's about anti-Semitism, and it's about generational trauma, and it's about how we think about our past and how that past shapes us in our present. And like, I just thought this was really beautifully done, and I loved it. And I really think this is one of those books that like everybody should pick up. I read We Were the Lucky Ones by Georgia Hunter. I read this because I saw it was being made into like a mini series for Hulu, and I wanted to watch it, but I wanted to read it first. And in my video where I talked about movies and TV, I said I thought I liked the TV series just a little bit better, but like this still made my top 10. Like, it's still an excellent book. So like, I would recommend reading it if you are more interested in reading than watching, but like both of them are really good. This is a story about a family, and Georgia Hunter is writing about her family. Like, it's her family history here. And she's telling the story about how they survived World War II. And that's why it's called We Were the Lucky Ones. Like, they were all incredibly lucky and fortunate that they were able to survive this war. They lived in Poland, and so you see like some of them in like different parts of Poland, but you also see like the ones who made it out and like what they went through. Like, one of the characters ends up in like Brazil, I think, at one point. Some of them end up in Siberia at one point. So like, we're all over the map. And I think that makes it so interesting because it's rare to get that in one book, where you get to see so many different perspectives of different places and events within the same like family, you know? So I thought this was really well done. And again, like, it's a Holocaust story where they all survive. So that alone makes me like super intrigued, because that's rare. Usually we're following like one character and everyone they know dies. So like, to see a whole family, like everyone in this family makes it through, and that's just so rare and amazing. Like, just reading, you got to read the story about it, right? Like, you have to know more. Nestlings made my top 10. Nat Cassidy is now officially a favorite author. I've read 3 of his books and gave all of them 5 stars. So like, this was my favorite though. This was my favorite Nat Cassidy I read this year. And I don't think I've ever read anything quite like it before. This is a story about a couple who is struggling they've just had their first child, and the mother has like this freak accident during labor where she ends up being paralyzed afterwards. And so she's not only dealing with the postpartum and all of that, but she's also struggling with this new disability and what that will mean for her going forward. And so we're following them as they get this offer. They win a lottery to move into this upscale apartment that is typically only for the very wealthy, but they're offering, like on a lottery system, a few apartments, and they get one of them. And they go to tour it and are immediately like, something doesn't feel right. But they're also like, but it's such a great opportunity. It's this historic building, and we would never be able to live here otherwise, and we shouldn't let that go. So despite all of the red flags, they move in. And I don't really want to talk too much about what actually happens, but it's dark and weird and very Jewish, which I didn't expect, but I loved, and just very weird. And I love that. I love like a story about like, I don't even want to call it a haunted house, even though technically I think this could sort of fit into that category, but barely. It's not exactly that. It's also on par with like Rosemary's Baby kind of a story. There's a lot of different elements happening in here, but they all work together really well. Nat Cassidy is an author I think you should check out. I think his work is really different and interesting. And then the last book in my top 10 is The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby Dare. I bet you knew this was going to be in here. This is yet another book I talked about almost incessantly this year because I just loved it and I want everyone to read it. And I put it in the Build Your Library self-education unit that I made because I was like, everyone should read this. This is a story about a girl named Aduni, and she lives in Nigeria in this little village, and her mother died fairly recently, and now her father does not know what to do with her. Like, he doesn't understand girls, and to him, they're just someone to marry off for money. Like, he will pass her down to whoever as long as they can give him enough money for her. And so all Aduni wants is to be educated. Like, her mother talked about her education a lot and how she wanted more for her. And so Aduni's grown up hearing like how important your education is, and so she doesn't want to get married when she's only like 14, and so she just wants desperately to be educated. And so she's on this quest to get an education, and you're following her through all these trials and tribulations that she has to go through and get over before she can finally get to what she's desperately after. And it's such a good story. It's so moving, so beautifully written. It is written in sort of a dialect, so if that's something you struggle with, I highly, highly, highly recommend the audio. The audiobook was fantastic. The narrator does an excellent job. And because I picked this up and just started reading with my eyes and was like, nope, can't. That's not going to work for me. And I listened to the audio, and I am so glad I switched and didn't just DNF this, because this ended up being one of my absolute favorite books of the year. One of my absolute favorite books going forward. Like, I could see this working itself into my, like, top 20 favorites of all time. So there you have it. That is my top 10 favorite books of 2024. I can't believe the year has come to an end. I'm both excited and anxious for what's coming next, but like, I'm looking forward to my reading year in 2025. I feel like my reading year is going to be amazing, so that's where I'm going to put my focus. So let me know down below in the comments, what was your favorite book of 2024? I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can pick a favorite, but if I absolutely had to, I'm just dropping everything. Nestlings and the Postcard would be my like top 2 favorites of the year, probably. Like, I feel like these are the ones that I thought about the most. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in my next video. Happy reading. Bye.